1968 was a very tumultuous year for the country. Can you describe the atmosphere and the political climate at the time?
Incredibly tense. After the King assassination, of course, riots broke out in some of the major cities in this country. There had been riots the year before as well, so that wasn't particularly new. And then there was the tension of a very competitive campaign where it was unclear who was going to emerge as the nominee, with sort of the Democratic establishment, if you will, wanting Humphrey to be the nominee. He had been a long-standing champion of progressive causes within the Democratic Party. He, of course, had been Johnson's vice president. He was the obvious person to come forward from the Johnson administration, but the timing wasn't right. You know, he wasn't a candidate in any of these primaries. And it's hard to imagine that today, because the primaries and the caucuses, they had caucuses then, but very few primaries, and the primaries really didn't select delegates. So it's a very different situation than 2016, where, you know, on the Republican side, Donald Trump is able to, in some ways, overwhelm the establishment and win the primaries, or win enough delegates going to the convention that he was going to be the nominee. I've sort of, in talks that I've given, have referred to it as a hostile takeover of the party, because Trump would not have been the choice of any of the leading Republicans. But he was able to defeat a whole series of candidates. You know, there were 17 in all, and he beat all 16 of his opponents, something that couldn't have happened back in 1968. Fewer primaries. Primaries weren't instrumental in selecting delegates at that time, and so Humphrey becomes the nominee. That infuriated the protesters even more, that they felt it was a very undemocratic process that had led to Hubert Humphrey's nomination.
Nixon ran on a very law and order type platform in 1968. Yes. Trump has used the term law and order on more than one occasion. Do you see parallels there?
Yeah, I think he's gone back to kind of the Nixon talking points of the 68 campaign, more stridently than even Nixon did. Nixon could use code words to kind of communicate what he was talking about. And again, there's a backdrop of riots in some of the major cities of this country. And then the other thing that I think was featured in the Nixon campaign was what was called the Southern Strategy. The idea there, because of civil rights legislation, which was hated among many white Southerners, the idea there was to try to move white Southerners in a Republican direction. Also in that campaign, George Wallace was a third-party candidate. And Wallace was, at that time, he changed later on, but at that time he was a strict segregationist, fighting to allow the South to continue its practices of segregation. And so Nixon basically was trying to, on the war, push people into his, or pull people into his camp, because the war, by widespread perceptions, wasn't going well. He had a secret plan to end the war, and it was so secret nobody knew what it was. The plan, I think, was to win the election and then kind of work forward from that. But he also wanted to try to pull Southern voters away from George Wallace. The feeling being that because of civil rights legislation, they were open to being persuaded to become Republicans, and many Republicans had opposed that legislation, although it was passed in 64 and 65 with Republican votes. They really needed Republican support. The Republican leadership in the Congress was in favor of that legislation, but the Republican candidate in 64, 4 years before, Barry Goldwater, had repudiated that legislation, campaigned against it. So there was all this ferment in 1968